Every grandmother leaves behind stories, but some are too dangerous to tell. When 12-year-old Nia follows her faithful German shepherd into the woods behind her grandmother's cabin, she discovers more than just another adventure. Deep within a moss-covered cave lies a weathered journal filled with decades of secrets, missing hikers, buried truths, and a family cover-up reaching back generations. What started as an innocent walk becomes a journey into her family's darkest history, one that some in town would kill to keep hidden, with her great-aunt Marian by her side. Nia must piece together clues, revealing why her grandmother warned her never to venture into those woods alone. But what happens when the people meant to protect you are hiding the truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like old memories, reluctant to let go. 12-year-old Nia Washington pressed her face against the cool window of Great-Aunt Marian's pickup truck, watching the familiar forest road wind toward her grandmother's cabin. 3 months had passed since the funeral, but the ache in her chest felt as fresh as the mountain air streaming through the cracked window. "You sure you're ready for this, baby girl?" Great-Aunt Marian's voice carried the weight of 63 years, each one etched in the worry lines around her dark eyes. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with the same determination she'd shown when she'd driven 12 hours straight from Detroit to collect Nia after the phone call came. Nia nodded, though she wasn't sure of anything anymore. The world had shifted when Grandma Rose died, tilting everything she thought she knew about family, about home, about the stories that held their lives together. But Samson needed this trip. The German shepherd had been pining in Marian's small apartment, his amber eyes constantly searching for something or someone who would never return, as if reading her thoughts. Samson lifted his massive head from the back seat, his black and tan coat catching the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. He'd been Grandma Rose's constant companion for 8 years, and in the months since her death, he'd grown restless, whining at windows and pacing through rooms like he was searching for traces of her scent. The cabin appeared through the trees like a scene from a half-remembered dream. Nia's breath caught in her throat. Time seemed to have paused here, waiting for their return. The log structure sat in the same small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and the wild rhododendrons that Grandma Rose had cultivated with such care. But the building itself showed the toll of abandonment, peeling chinking between the logs, a few loose shingles on the roof, and windows that reflected the sky like clouded cataracts. Marian parked beside the old stone steps and turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt dense, loaded with memory and loss. Samson immediately began pawing at the door, his tail wagging for the first time since they'd left Detroit. "Hold on there, boy," Marian said softly, reaching into her purse. She pulled out an ornate brass key, its surface tarnished with age and handling. "Rose gave me this the last time I visited. Said someday it would be important." She held it up to catch the light. "Funny how she always seemed to know things before the rest of us figured them out." Nia took the key, feeling its weight in her palm. It was heavier than expected, with intricate scrollwork around the head that reminded her of the patterns in Grandma Rose's quilts. For just a moment, she could almost smell her grandmother's lavender soap, almost hear the soft humming that used to drift from the kitchen during their summer visits. The key turned easily in the lock, as if the cabin had been waiting for them. The door swung open with a familiar creak, releasing the scent of aged wood and dried herbs. Samson bounded past them, his claws clicking on the hardwood floors as he began a systematic search of every room, every corner, every place where Grandma Rose's presence might linger. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through windows that needed washing. Everything was exactly as Grandma Rose had left it. The hand-carved dining table still set with her best china, the bookshelf lined with volumes of poetry and local history, the old rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. On the mantelpiece, framed photographs chronicled decades of family gatherings, summer visits, and quiet moments between a grandmother and her only grandchild. "She kept everything just so," Marian murmured. running her finger along a dust-free surface. Even at the end, when her arthritis was so bad she could barely hold a coffee cup, she'd fuss about keeping this place ready for visitors. Nia moved through the rooms like a pilgrim visiting a sacred site. Each object held a story, a memory, a piece of the summers that had shaped her understanding of the world. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon and sage. The bedroom, where she'd slept during visits, retained the cheerful yellow walls and the quilt Grandma Rose had made from fabric scraps, each square representing a different dress, shirt, or piece of clothing that had been part of their family's history. But it was in the small study off the main room that Nia felt her grandmother's presence most strongly. This had been Rose's private sanctuary, where she'd kept her correspondence, her journals, and the countless notebooks filled with observations about the changing seasons, the behavior of local wildlife, and the comings and goings of neighbors. A massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface polished smooth by decades of use. Drawers lined both sides, each one secured with small brass locks that matched the cabin key's design. Above the desk, a large window offered a perfect view of the forest that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "Your grandmother spent hours at that desk," Marian said, joining Nia in the doorway. "Writing, reading, watching. Sometimes I think she knew every tree in those woods, every path, every creature that called it home. She always told me not to go too far," Nia remembered. "Never past the old lightning-struck oak, never alone, never without Samson." Marian's expression grew thoughtful. "Rose had her reasons for everything, baby girl. She understood things about this place, about these woods, that most folks couldn't see." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Samson appeared in the doorway, his tail wagging uncertainly. He'd completed his circuit of the cabin and seemed confused by his failure to find what he was looking for. Instead, he moved to Nia's side, pressing his warm bulk against her legs in a gesture of comfort that had become their shared language of grief. "What do you think, boy?" Nia asked, scratching behind his ears. "Ready to explore?" The German shepherd's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He bounded toward the back door, his entire body vibrating with anticipation. For the first time in months, he looked like his old self, alert, eager, purposeful. Marian opened the back door, and Samson burst onto the covered porch that overlooked the garden. Grandma Rose's vegetable plots had gone wild in her absence, but the perennial herbs continued to thrive. Mint and chives sprouted between the weathered planks of the walkway, while lavender and rosemary perfumed the afternoon air. Beyond the garden, the forest beckoned with the same mysterious allure that had captivated Nia during every childhood visit. The trees here were ancient, massive pines and oaks that had been growing when her great-great-grandmother first settled in these mountains. Their canopy created a world of shifting light and deep shadows, paths that seemed to change with the seasons, and sounds that spoke of life both visible and hidden. "She used to sit right here," Marian said, settling into one of the 2 rocking chairs on the porch. "Every morning with her coffee, every evening with her tea. Watching, listening, keeping track of things." "What kind of things?" Marian was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the tree line. "Your grandmother was what folks used to call a knowing woman. She saw connections others missed, patterns in the natural world that most people walk right past. She understood that the forest has its own memory, its own way of keeping secrets." Nia felt a familiar shiver of curiosity mixed with unease. Grandma Rose had always hinted at mysteries in these woods, stories that went deeper than the local folklore about early settlers and displaced wildlife. There were references to old families with complicated histories, to events that had shaped the community in ways that weren't written in any official records. "Did she ever tell you about the Hendricks family?" Nia asked, remembering fragments of whispered conversations she'd overheard during previous visits. Marian's rocking chair stopped moving. "Where did you hear that name?" "Grandma Rose mentioned them once. Something about old disputes, about land that should have belonged to our family. That's ancient history, baby girl." Water under the bridge, but Nia could hear the careful neutrality in her great-aunt's voice, the same tone adults used when they were avoiding difficult truths. It was the same voice Grandma Rose had used whenever Nia asked too many questions about the family's past, about why they'd never owned more land, despite being among the first black families to settle in the area. Samson had been exploring the garden, following scent trails only he could detect. Now he returned to the porch, his attention focused on something beyond the trees. His ears pricked forward, and he released a low whine that seemed to vibrate with purpose. "What is it, boy?" Nia asked, following his gaze. The German shepherd looked back at her, then toward the forest, then back again. The message was unmistakable. He wanted to go exploring, and he wanted her to come with him. "Not today," Marian said firmly. "We've got enough to deal with just getting the cabin aired out and deciding what needs to be done with Rose's things." But even as she spoke, Nia could see that Samson had no intention of spending the afternoon indoors. His restlessness had returned, intensified by being back in familiar territory. He moved to the edge of the porch and looked back expectantly, his amber eyes bright with intelligence and determination. "He's been cooped up for months," Nia pointed out. "Maybe just a short walk on one of the marked trails." Marian considered this, weighing her protective instincts against her understanding of what both girl and dog needed. "Stay on the main path, don't go past the creek, and be back before dark." Nia nodded eagerly, already moving toward the steps. But as she reached for Samson's leash hanging beside the door, Marian caught her arm. "Your grandmother had rules about these woods for good reasons," she said quietly. "Promise me you'll remember that." "I promise." But as Nia clipped the leash to Samson's collar and headed toward the forest, she carried with her more than just her grandmother's warnings. She carried questions that had been building for years. Curiosity about the stories that lived in the shadows between what was spoken and what was left unsaid. The forest welcomed them with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a wood thrush. Samson immediately took the lead, pulling toward paths that branched away from the main trail into darker, deeper parts of the woods where the canopy grew thick and the silence held weight. For now, Nia held him back, keeping her promise to stay on familiar ground. But she could feel something calling to her from those deeper places, something that had been waiting patiently for her return. The brass key seemed to grow warmer in her pocket, as if it were responding to more than just the heat of her body. Whatever secrets these woods held, whatever truths had shaped her family's history, Nia sensed that her time of not knowing was coming to an end. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with that particular quality of mountain light that made everything look newly washed. Nia woke to the sound of Samson pacing restlessly across the cabin's wooden floors, his claws clicking in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained urgency. "Easy, boy," she murmured, pulling on her hiking boots. Through the window, she could see Great-Aunt Marian on the front porch with her morning coffee, absorbed in sorting through a box of Grandma Rose's papers. It seemed like the perfect time for a longer walk, a chance to let Samson work off whatever energy had been building in him since their arrival. The German shepherd barely waited for her to clip on his leash before pulling toward the back door. But as soon as they stepped onto the porch, something changed in his demeanor. Instead of his usual eager exploration of familiar scents around the garden, Samson's entire body went rigid, his ears pricked forward with laser focus. "What is it?" Nia asked, following his gaze toward the tree line. Samson whined low in his throat, a sound she'd never heard from him before. It wasn't the happy anticipation of a walk, or the mild frustration of being held back. This was something deeper, more primal, as if he was responding to a call only he could hear. Without warning, he lunged forward with such force that the leash slipped from Nia's grip. Instead of stopping at her sharp command, as he usually did, Samson disappeared into the forest like he was being pulled by an invisible rope. "Samson!" Nia called, her voice echoing between the trees. She could hear him crashing through the underbrush ahead, moving with purposeful determination rather than his usual methodical investigation of interesting smells. She hurried after him, following the sound of his movement through vegetation that grew thicker with each step. This wasn't the well-maintained trail they'd walked the day before. Samson was leading her deeper into the forest than she'd ever ventured, past the creek that marked the boundary of her usual explorations, beyond the lightning-struck oak that had always served as her turning-back point. The terrain here was different, wilder, less touched by human presence. Ancient trees created a canopy so dense that the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Moss covered fallen logs like green velvet, and the air carried scents of deep earth and growing things that spoke of places where time moved differently. "Samson, wait!" Nia called again, but her voice seemed to be absorbed by the forest itself, muffled by the thick air and the patient silence of very old trees. She followed the sounds of his passage for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Just when she was beginning to worry that they were truly lost, the sounds ahead stopped abruptly. Nia pushed through a wall of rhododendron bushes and found herself in a small clearing she'd never seen before. Samson stood at the base of a moss-covered outcropping of rock, his tail wagging uncertainly. As Nia approached, she realized what had captured his attention. What she'd initially taken for a natural formation was actually the mouth of a cave, hidden so completely by vegetation that it would be nearly impossible to spot unless you were standing directly in front of it. "How did you know this was here?" she asked wonderingly. The German shepherd looked back at her with an expression that seemed almost human in its intelligence, then trotted directly into the cave's mouth as if he'd been here countless times before. Nia hesitated. Every warning her grandmother had ever given her about the forest seemed to echo in the still air. But Samson had never led her anywhere dangerous, and his behavior suggested he knew exactly where he was going. She pulled out her phone and activated its flashlight, then followed him into the cave. The entrance was narrow, requiring her to duck slightly, but it opened almost immediately into a larger chamber. Her phone's light revealed smooth stone walls and a floor that had been worn smooth by centuries of water flow. The cave extended back into darkness beyond the reach of her light, and the air carried a coolness that spoke of deep earth and hidden spaces. But it was what occupied the cave that made Nia catch her breath. Someone had been using this space, not recently, but regularly over a long period of time. Against one wall, she could make out the remains of old camping equipment, a rolled sleeping bag, a camp stove, several containers that might once have held food or water. Everything was covered with a layer of dust and debris that suggested years of abandonment, but the arrangement spoke of habitation, of someone who had treated this hidden space as a refuge. Samson had moved to a pile of objects near the back of the chamber, and was sniffing intently at something half hidden beneath a piece of oiled cloth. Nia approached carefully, her phone's light revealing more details with each step. Under the cloth, she found a leather-bound journal, its cover darkened with age and handling. The binding was still intact, held together with string that had been retied multiple times. Next to it lay a pencil worn down to a stub, and several sheets of loose paper covered with handwriting in faded ink. With trembling hands, Nia picked up the journal and opened it to the first page. The date at the top was from 15 years ago, and the handwriting was careful, methodical, the kind of penmanship that spoke of someone who took great care with their words. June 15th. Another one has gone missing. Sarah Martinez, 23, from Atlanta. They're seen on the trail near Copper Ridge. The others think she probably got turned around, maybe fell into a ravine. But I know better. This makes 7 in the past 3 years, and the pattern is always the same. Nia's heart began to race. She flipped to another entry, dated 2 months later. August 3rd, found Sarah's backpack today, buried under rocks near the old mining claim. Just like the others. Someone doesn't want these hikers to be found, and someone with enough local knowledge to know where to hide the evidence. The authorities won't listen. They want to believe these are accidents, isolated incidents. But I've been keeping track, and I can see what they refuse to see. The journal was filled with similar entries, each one documenting another disappearance, another piece of evidence found and ignored by official investigations. The writer had been conducting their own search, mapping patterns, recording details that painted a picture of something far more sinister than random accidents in dangerous terrain. But it was an entry dated just 2 years ago that made Nia's blood turn cold. May 20th. They're getting bolder. Found evidence that they've been using the old Washington property as a dumping ground. Rose Washington's family has owned that land for generations, but they've been pushed off, most of it, through legal tricks and intimidation. If Rose knew what was happening on her ancestors' land, it would break her heart. The Washington family has suffered enough injustice. They shouldn't have to bear this too. Washington property. Rose Washington. Nia's hands shook as she held the journal, understanding flooding through her like ice water. This wasn't just about missing hikers. This was about her family, her grandmother, land that should have belonged to them. She flipped through more pages, finding reference after reference to the Washington family, to legal disputes going back decades, to powerful local families who had used intimidation and worse to claim land that wasn't rightfully theirs. And then, near the end of the filled pages, she found an entry that made her sink to her knees on the cave floor. September 1st, Rose Washington came to see me today. She knows. Somehow, she's figured out what's been happening, and she's terrified. Not for herself. Rose has never been afraid of anything, but for her granddaughter. She made me promise that if anything happens to her, I'll make sure Nia is protected. She gave me something to keep safe. Something that could expose all of them if the time ever comes. I've hidden it where only someone who knew Rose's heart would think to look. Nia stared at the page, her grandmother's name seeming to glow in the light from her phone. Rose had known about this, had known about the missing hikers, about the cover-up, about whatever conspiracy had been operating in these mountains for years. "Oh, Samson," she whispered, and the German shepherd moved to her side, pressing his warm body against her, as if he understood the magnitude of what she'd discovered. She photographed several of the most important pages with her phone, then carefully closed the journal and tucked it inside her jacket. Whatever else was hidden in this cave would have to wait. She needed to get back to Great-Aunt Marian, needed to share what she'd found, needed to understand what her grandmother had known and why she'd kept it secret. The walk back to the cabin felt endless. Samson led the way with the same purposeful determination he'd shown on the journey out, as if he'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. But Nia's mind raced with questions and implications that seemed to grow more frightening with each step. She found Great-Aunt Marian exactly where she'd left her, still sorting through papers on the front porch. But when Marian looked up and saw Nia's expression, her coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "Baby girl, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Nia pulled the journal from her jacket and held it out with shaking hands. "Aunt Marian, I think Grandma Rose was in danger. I think she knew something that got her killed." The coffee cup slipped from Marian's fingers, shattering on the porch boards in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. Her face went ashen, and for a moment she seemed to age a decade before Nia's eyes. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. "In a cave. Samson led me there like he knew exactly where to go." Nia opened the journal to one of the pages she'd marked. "It's all here, Aunt Marian. Missing hikers, cover-ups, people who've been using our family's land for terrible things. And Grandma Rose knew about it." Marian reached out with trembling hands and took the journal, her eyes scanning the page Nia had shown her. As she read, her expression shifted from shock to fear to something that looked almost like resignation. "Sweet Lord," she breathed. "Rose, what did you get yourself into?" "You knew something," Nia said, studying her great-aunt's face. "You knew she was in danger." Marian closed the journal carefully and looked out at the forest as if it had suddenly become a place of threat rather than beauty. "I knew she was worried about something in those last months. She kept asking me about legal documents, about making sure you were provided for, about what would happen to the cabin if something happened to her." She turned to meet Nia's eyes. "But I never imagined it was anything like this." The weight of discovery settled over both of them like a shroud. Nia had come to the cabin seeking connection with her grandmother's memory. Instead, she'd uncovered a mystery that threatened to rewrite everything she thought she knew about her family's history. and somewhere in the forest around them, the people responsible for the secrets in that journal were still out there, still protecting their conspiracy with methods that had already cost too many lives. That evening, while Great-Aunt Marian prepared dinner with unusual quiet concentration, Nia retreated to her grandmother's study with the journal. The brass key from her pocket opened the desk drawers easily, and she spread the journal's pages across the polished oak surface, photographing each entry with methodical care. The pattern became clearer with every page she read. The disappearances weren't random accidents. They followed a timeline that corresponded with specific events in the community. Hikers vanished during town council elections, during zoning hearings, during any period when outside attention might focus on land use in the area. March 12th, David Kim disappeared 2 days before the environmental impact hearing. His research into water table contamination would have shut down the Hendricks mining operation permanently. Now the hearing has been postponed indefinitely due to lack of expert testimony. The name Hendricks appeared again and again throughout the entries, always in connection with the missing people, always linked to business interests that benefited from the disappearances. Nia began to understand that her family wasn't just connected to this conspiracy, they were its primary victims. It was while photographing a page near the middle of the journal that something fluttered loose from the binding. A faded photograph, creased with age and handling, landed face up on the desk. The image showed a group of 7 people standing in front of what Nia recognized as the old town hall. Based on their clothing and the photo's sepia tones, it had been taken sometime in the 1970s or early 1980s. In the center stood a young black woman who made Nia's breath catch. It was unmistakably her grandmother, perhaps 30 years younger, wearing a simple dress and an expression of fierce determination. Surrounding Grandma Rose were 6 other people, a mix of men and women, all appearing to be involved in some kind of official proceeding. But what made Nia's skin crawl was that someone had deliberately scratched out one of the faces, scoring the photograph's surface with such violence that the paper was torn in places. She flipped the photograph over and found an inscription in her grandmother's careful handwriting. The day we testified about the mining claims. Some truths are too dangerous to forget, but too deadly to remember. Rose, 1983, baby girl. Dinner's ready, Great-Aunt Marian called from the kitchen. Nia quickly tucked the photograph between the pages of the journal and joined her great-aunt at the small dining table. Marian had prepared one of Grandma Rose's favorite meals, fried chicken, green beans cooked with bacon, and cornbread that filled the cabin with familiar warmth. But despite the comfort food, tension stretched between them like a taut wire. "Aunt Marian," Nia began carefully, "when you were growing up, did Grandma Rose ever talk about problems with other families in town? Legal disputes, maybe?" Marian's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Why do you ask?" "I keep finding references to the Hendricks family and to land that should have belonged to us." Nia pulled out her phone and showed one of the photographed journal pages. "According to this, our family lost a lot of property through what sounds like fraud." "That's ancient history," Marian said quickly. But her eyes avoided Nia's. "Nothing we can change now. But what if it's not just history? What if these same people are still—" "Nia!" Marian's voice carried a sharpness that made Samson look up from his spot by the fireplace. "Some stories are better left alone. Your grandmother had her reasons for not dwelling on old grievances." But Nia could see the fear in her great-aunt's eyes. The same careful neutrality she'd noticed before when difficult topics arose. It was the look of someone who knew more than they were willing to share. The next morning, Nia decided to take a different approach. She walked into town with Samson, ostensibly to pick up supplies, but really to see how local people reacted when she asked about the past. The general store occupied the same building it had for nearly a century, its wide front porch serving as an informal gathering place for long-time residents. An elderly white man with weathered hands was arranging fishing tackle in the front window when Nia approached. "Morning," she said politely. "I'm Rose Washington's granddaughter. I'm staying at her cabin for a few weeks." The man's friendly expression flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Oh, Rose's granddaughter. Sorry for your loss." She was quite a woman. "Thank you. I've been going through some of her papers, and I found this old photograph." Nia showed him the image on her phone. "I'm trying to identify the people in it. Maybe learn more about what was happening when it was taken." The man glanced at the photograph, and his face went carefully blank. "Can't say I recognize anyone," he said, though Nia was certain she'd seen something like recognition flicker across his features. "That's from before my time in town." But before Nia could ask another question, a woman emerged from the store's interior, younger, perhaps in her 50s, with sharp eyes that took in every detail of the conversation. "Charlie, you're needed in the back," she said firmly, then turned to Nia with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Susan Hendricks. I manage the store. Is there something I can help you find?" Hendricks. The name from the journal made Nia's pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. "Just looking around, thanks." "Beautiful area you have here." "Yes, it is. Peaceful. We like to keep it that way." Susan's gaze lingered on Nia's phone. "I hope you'll enjoy your visit. Though I should warn you, those old mountain trails can be dangerous for someone who doesn't know them well. We've had hikers get lost over the years. Some never found their way back." The warning carried an undercurrent that made Samson press closer to Nia's side, a low rumble building in his chest. Other people in the store had stopped their conversations, creating a silence that felt deliberately uncomfortable. "I'll be careful," Nia said, backing toward the door. "My grandmother taught me to respect the mountains." "Your grandmother was a wise woman," Susan replied. "Wise enough to know when to leave well enough alone." Outside, Nia's hands shook as she clipped Samson's leash back on. The encounter had confirmed her suspicions. The Hendricks family was still powerful in this community, and they were still invested in keeping certain secrets buried. As they walked back toward the cabin, Samson suddenly stopped, his entire body going rigid. Following his gaze, Nia saw a dark pickup truck parked along the road ahead, its occupants watching their approach. When the driver realized he'd been spotted, the truck pulled away quickly, but not before Nia caught a glimpse of the man behind the wheel, the same Charlie who had claimed not to recognize anyone in her grandmother's photograph. "They're watching us," she whispered to Samson. The German shepherd's response was to position himself between Nia and the direction the truck had gone, his protective instincts now fully activated. Whatever innocent exploration Nia had thought she was conducting was over. She was asking questions that someone desperately wanted to keep unanswered, and her presence in town was already being monitored. When they reached the cabin, Great-Aunt Marian was waiting on the porch with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I've been worried sick. Just to the store." Nia studied her great-aunt's face. "Aunt Marian, do you know a woman named Susan Hendricks?" Marian's face went ashen. "You talked to Susan Hendricks. She seemed very interested in making sure I understood how dangerous the hiking trails can be." "Oh, Lord," Marian breathed, sinking into her rocking chair. "Baby girl, you don't understand what you're stirring up." "The Hendricks family. They have long memories and longer reaches." "Then help me understand," Nia pleaded. "Tell me what Grandma Rose was so afraid of. Tell me why she really died." But Marian just shook her head, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "Some knowledge is too dangerous to carry, Nia. Your grandmother learned that the hard way, and now you're walking the same path." As if to emphasize her point, the sound of another truck engine drifted up from the road below, moving slowly, deliberately, like someone was taking careful note of the cabin, its occupants, and their daily routines. Samson's growl grew deeper, and he moved to stand guard at the edge of the porch, his amber eyes fixed on the forest where shadows were beginning to gather with the approaching dusk. Whatever protection Grandma Rose had managed to maintain through years of careful silence was eroding with each question Nia asked, each connection she made. The photograph in the journal represented more than just historical documentation. It was evidence of her grandmother's courage in speaking truth to power. But it was also proof that such courage came with a price that was still being paid. decades later by anyone brave enough or foolish enough to follow in Rose Washington's footsteps. The sleepless night following her encounter at the general store left Nia more determined than ever to understand what her grandmother had been protecting her from, while great-aunt Marian worked in the garden, deliberately keeping herself busy with safe concrete tasks. Nia returned to the cave with Samson as her steadfast companion. This time, she came prepared with a proper flashlight and a backpack filled with supplies. The cave welcomed them with the same cool silence as before, but now Nia approached it with the systematic attention of someone conducting a real investigation, rather than stumbling into discoveries by accident. In the deeper recesses of the chamber, her flashlight beam revealed details she'd missed during her first visit. Someone had lived here regularly, not just used it for storage, but actually spent extended periods in this hidden sanctuary. A makeshift shelf held canned goods with expiration dates spanning several years. A sleeping area had been arranged with careful attention to comfort and concealment, but it was what she found, tucked behind a loose rock in the cave wall, that made everything else suddenly make sense. Wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture was a hand-drawn map, meticulously detailed and annotated in the same careful handwriting as the journal. The map showed the entire mountain region, but not in the way any official survey would depict it. This was a map of secrets, trails that didn't appear on any public documentation, locations marked with symbols that spoke of hidden dangers, and most importantly, a network of routes that connected the cave to various points throughout the forest. Some locations were marked with simple X's, others with dates, still others with numbers that might represent distances or counts of some kind. Near what appeared to be the old mining claims, someone had drawn a series of connected boxes with the notation, "Disposal sites. Confirmed." "My God," Nia whispered, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't just documentation of missing hikers. This was a map of where the bodies had been hidden. Samson pressed against her leg, sensing her distress, and she scratched behind his ears while studying the map more closely. One trail, marked in darker ink than the others, led from the cave directly toward what the map labeled as Washington Original Claim, Disputed Territory. "Come on, boy," she said, tucking the map carefully into her backpack. "Let's see what Grandma Rose's land really looked like before it was stolen." Following the trail marked on the map proved easier than Nia had expected. Someone had maintained this route regularly, keeping branches cleared and obstacles marked. It led through parts of the forest that felt older, wilder, where the trees grew so close together that the canopy blocked most of the sky. After nearly an hour of hiking, they emerged into a clearing that took Nia's breath away. A small stream meandered through grass that grew thick and green, fed by a spring that bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks. The entire area radiated the kind of peace that came from being undisturbed for generations. But peace wasn't what made Nia's heart race. It was the evidence of recent activity that shouldn't have been there. Near the stream, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, she found the remnants of camping equipment, tents that had been taken down hastily, fire rings that had been deliberately scattered, and most chilling of all, personal belongings that had been abandoned, as if their owners had left in great haste or had been prevented from taking them. A woman's hiking boot, still laced but worn through in a way that suggested its owner had been walking for days. A man's wallet, emptied of cash and identification, but still containing family photographs of children who would never see their father return home. A day pack with trail maps and energy bars, the kind of careful preparation that spoke of an experienced hiker who wouldn't have simply gotten lost and wandered off. "Someone cleaned this up," Nia said to Samson, who was systematically sniffing each discovered object. "But they didn't do a very good job." She was photographing the evidence with her phone when the sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush made her freeze. Someone was approaching the clearing, and they weren't trying to be quiet about it. "Don't move," a man's voice called out, rough with anger and something that might have been fear. "Turn around slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." Nia obeyed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man who emerged from the tree line was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in work clothes that had seen hard use. His face was weathered by outdoor work, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed very little. "You're Rose Washington's granddaughter," he said. "And it wasn't a question." "Yes. And you found the cave." Nia nodded, not trusting her voice. The man studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to some internal decision. "My name is Marcus Chen. I wrote that journal you found." The revelation hit Nia like a physical blow. "You're alive." "Barely." Marcus kept his distance, but his posture relaxed slightly. "I've been living like a ghost for 2 years, ever since they figured out I was getting too close to the truth." He gestured toward the abandoned camping gear. "This was my base before I had to relocate to the cave full-time. The missing hikers are all dead," Marcus said bluntly. "Killed because they discovered things that powerful people needed to keep hidden. Your grandmother was trying to protect you by keeping you away from all this." Samson had positioned himself between Nia and Marcus, not aggressive, but clearly ready to defend her if necessary. Marcus noticed the dog's protective stance and nodded with approval. "Smart animal. He knows we're all in danger just by being here." Marcus looked around the clearing, as if expecting threats to materialize from the forest itself. "You need to take that evidence you found and get as far away from here as possible. Tonight." "I can't leave," Nia said. "Not when I'm finally learning the truth about what happened to my family. Your family lost everything because they tried to fight people who have no limits on what they'll do to protect their interests," Marcus replied. "Your grandmother spent her whole life paying the price for one moment of courage when she testified against the Hendricks mining operation. Don't make the same mistake." "What mistake?" "Telling the truth. Thinking that truth matters more than survival." Marcus pulled out a battered cell phone and showed her the screen. "I've been documenting everything for 5 years. I have evidence that would put half the town council in prison and shut down operations that have been running since the 1970s. But I can't use it without getting myself and anyone who helps me killed." The weight of hopelessness in his voice made Nia understand just how deep and dangerous this conspiracy really was. But it also sparked something stubborn in her, an inheritance from her grandmother that wouldn't be silenced by threats. "There has to be a way," she said. "Some authority we can trust, some way to get the evidence to people who can act on it." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Child, the sheriff's department, the mayor's office, the county commissioners, they're all either bought or scared. The only reason your grandmother lived as long as she did was because she agreed to keep quiet. But even that protection has limits. You think she was murdered? I think she died right when you were old enough to start asking questions she couldn't answer without putting you at risk." Marcus shouldered a worn backpack that seemed to contain everything he owned. "They let her live as long as she kept you away from here. Now that you're back sniffing around asking the right questions, the arrangement is void." As if to emphasize his words, the distant sound of engines drifted through the forest, multiple vehicles, moving with the systematic pattern of a search rather than casual travel. "They're coming," Marcus said grimly. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when Susan Hendricks is asking questions about who her customers have been talking to. Samson's ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. He could hear what was coming even before the humans could, and his body language spoke of immediate danger approaching through the trees. "There's a back trail," Marcus said, pointing toward a gap in the vegetation that Nia wouldn't have noticed without guidance. "Follow it for about half a mile, then cut west toward the main road. Don't go back to the cabin, they'll be watching it. I can't leave Aunt Marian. Your aunt has been dealing with these people for 40 years longer than you have," Marcus interrupted. "She knows how to survive. Right now, you're the one who needs to disappear." The engine sounds were growing closer, and now Nia could distinguish individual vehicles, at least 3 of them, coordinating their approach to surround the clearing. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they moved toward the hidden trail. Marcus paused, his expression softening for just a moment. "Because your grandmother asked me to." The last conversation we ever had, she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd do everything in my power to keep you safe." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "She left this for you, in case the time ever came." Then he was gone, melting into the forest with the skill of someone who had been evading capture for years. Nia clutched the paper in one hand and Samson's leash in the other, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what she'd learned. As they hurried along the concealed trail, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, and Nia realized that her quiet investigation into her grandmother's secrets had just become a fight for her life. The back trail Marcus had shown her led to a rarely used logging road, and from there Nia found her way to the main highway. She used her phone to call a taxi from the nearest town, her hands still shaking from the encounter in the forest. During the hour-long wait, she sat on a fallen log with Samson pressed against her side, finally reading the note her grandmother had left with Marcus. "My dearest Nia, if you are reading this, then the time has come for truth-telling, no matter the cost. In the cave where Marcus hides, behind the loose stone on the north wall, you will find what I could never show you while I was alive. Use it wisely, and remember that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right despite the fear. All my love, Grandma Rose." When the taxi finally arrived, Nia gave the driver Great-Aunt Marian's address in the nearest town rather than the cabin. She needed to approach this situation more carefully now that she understood the level of danger involved. She found Marian pacing anxiously in her small apartment, relief flooding her face when Nia walked through the door. "Thank God," Marian breathed, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "When I went looking for you and found the cabin empty, I knew something had gone wrong." They were watching the cabin. 3 trucks, parked where they could see all the approaches. Marian's voice carried the weight of decades of accumulated fear. "I recognized 2 of the men, Tom Hendricks and his son Bradley. They've been running the same intimidation tactics for 40 years. Nia settled onto Marian's couch with Samson at her feet, finally ready to hear the full truth. "Tell me everything, Aunt Marian." "I met Marcus Chen today, and I know about the journal about the missing hikers. But I need to understand how deep this goes." Marian poured herself a cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "It started in 1978, when Rose was just 22 years old. She was working as a bookkeeper for several local businesses, including some of the mining operations. She saw things, financial records, shipping manifests, payments that didn't match the official reports. What kind of payments? Money changing hands for permits that should have been denied, environmental reports that were falsified to hide contamination, and eventually payments to make problems disappear permanently." Marian settled into the chair across from Nia, her expression growing distant with painful memories. "The first person she saw them kill was a federal inspector named James Morrison. He'd been investigating water contamination from the mining operations, getting close to proving that they'd been dumping toxic waste on land they didn't legally own. Our family's land. Land that had belonged to our people since Reconstruction, yes. But the Hendricks family had been working for decades to claim it through legal manipulation, forged documents, and, when necessary, intimidation." Marian's voice grew heavy. "Morrison's death was made to look like an accident, a fall from a cliff during a solo hike. But Rose had seen him arguing with Tom Hendricks the night before. She knew it wasn't an accident." Nia thought about the journal entries she'd read, the pattern of disappearances that always seemed to coincide with threats to the Hendricks family's business interests. She tried to report it? She tried. But Tom Hendricks' brother was the sheriff then, and his uncle was the county prosecutor. Rose quickly learned that the corruption went all the way to the top. Marian's coffee sat cooling in her hands, forgotten. That's when she started documenting everything herself, keeping records that she hoped might someday serve as evidence. The photograph I found, that was from when she testified. Against the mining expansion in 1983, yes. Rose was the only person brave enough to speak publicly about what she'd witnessed. She had documentation of the illegal dumping, the forged permits, even witness testimony from other workers who'd seen things they weren't supposed to see. Marian's expression grew pained. It didn't matter. The zoning board voted to approve the expansion anyway, and within 6 months, 2 of the other witnesses had moved away suddenly, and one died in what was ruled a hunting accident, but Grandma Rose kept fighting.
For a while.
Until she realized the cost wasn't just to herself. Marian met Nia's eyes with an expression of profound sadness. Your grandmother was pregnant then. Your mother was born in 1984, right in the middle of the worst of the harassment and threats. The revelation hit Nia like a physical blow. Her mother had been born into this conflict, raised in the shadow of her grandmother's dangerous knowledge. Is that why Mom moved away? To get us away from all this? Your mother never knew the full truth. Rose was very careful about that. But yes, she encouraged your mother to build a life far from these mountains, to make sure that you would grow up safe. Marian's voice broke slightly. When your mother died in that car accident, Rose was terrified that the Hendricks family might see you as a renewed threat when you came of age. That's why she always warned me about the woods. Why she never wanted me to explore too far or ask too many questions. She was trying to protect you the only way she knew how, by keeping you ignorant of the danger. Nia pulled out her phone and showed Marian the photographs she'd taken of the journal entries. But Marcus Chen didn't stay ignorant. He's been documenting everything for years. Marian studied the images with growing alarm. Marcus is the son of David Chen, one of the workers who testified alongside Rose in 1983. David died in that hunting accident I mentioned, so Marcus has been carrying on his father's investigation, at the cost of his life. From what you're describing, the Hendricks family doesn't allow loose ends to remain loose indefinitely. Nia thought about her encounter with Susan Hendricks at the general store, the calculated way she'd delivered her warning about dangerous trails. How powerful are they now? The Hendricks family? Tom Hendricks died 5 years ago, but his son Bradley runs the mining operation now, and his daughter Susan manages most of the family's business interests in town. They own the sheriff, the mayor, half the county commission, and most of the businesses that matter. Marian's expression grew grim. More importantly, they've expanded beyond just mining. Drug trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, they've turned this entire region into their personal criminal empire. And the missing hikers? We're getting too close to discovering something that could expose the whole operation. A trail camera here, a photograph there, GPS coordinates that showed activities in places where nothing legal should have been happening. Nia remembered Marcus's map with its notations about disposal sites. They're using our family's stolen land as a dumping ground, among other things. Rose suspected they were burying more than just toxic waste out there. The full scope of what her grandmother had been protecting her from was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about historical injustice or environmental crimes. It was about an ongoing criminal conspiracy that had been operating for decades. Protected by corruption and enforced by murder. There has to be a way to stop them, Nia said. Some authority that isn't corrupted. Someone who could act on all this evidence Marcus has collected. Marian shook her head sadly. Baby girl, Rose spent 40 years looking for that honest authority. The few times she thought she'd found someone trustworthy, they either got bought off, scared off, or ended up like Sheriff Morrison in 1987. What happened to Sheriff Morrison? He was the one honest lawman Rose ever encountered. Took her evidence seriously, started a real investigation. Marian's expression grew haunted. They found his body at the bottom of Bear Creek Gorge. Fell while investigating reports of illegal activity in the forest. Nia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Marcus mentioned finding a sheriff's badge in the cave. That would be Morrison's badge. Rose found it at the scene before the official investigators arrived. She kept it as evidence, but also as a reminder of what happens to people who try to fight the Hendricks family through official channels, as if responding to the gravity of their conversation. Samson lifted his head and looked toward the window, his ears pricked with attention. In the distance, the sound of slow-moving vehicles drifted through the evening air. They found us, Marian said grimly, recognizing the same systematic search pattern they'd employed at the cabin. Nia moved to the window and peered through the blinds. 3 pickup trucks were moving slowly through the apartment complex, their occupants clearly searching for something specific. "We need to leave," she said. "Now." But as they gathered their essential belongings, Nia realized that running wasn't a solution. It was just another form of the silence that had protected the Hendricks family for decades. Somewhere in that cave, her grandmother had hidden evidence that could finally bring justice. The question was whether Nia had the courage to retrieve it and find someone brave enough to act on it. Outside, the sound of engines grew closer, and time was running out for making that choice. They left Marian's apartment through the back exit, slipping into the gathering darkness while the search vehicles circled the front of the building. Marian had insisted on driving to her sister's house 2 towns over, but Nia convinced her to make one stop first, at the county courthouse, which stayed open late on certain evenings for public records research. "This is madness," Marian whispered as they parked behind the courthouse. "If they're watching the apartment, they'll be watching public buildings too." "Maybe," Nia said, scanning the parking lot for any sign of the pickup trucks they'd evaded. "But Marcus said my grandmother left something for me to find in the cave. I need to understand what we're really dealing with before we run." Inside the courthouse, a bored clerk directed them to the basement records room, where decades of property deeds, court filings, and municipal documents gathered dust in climate-controlled storage. Nia had been here once before during a high school research project, but she'd never imagined she'd return searching for evidence of her own family's stolen legacy. The Washington family files were thicker than she'd expected, chronicling generations of land ownership, property disputes, and legal battles that painted a picture of systematic dispossession stretching back to the early 1900s, but it was a manila folder marked Washington versus Hendricks Mining Consortium, 1979, that contained the smoking gun she'd been looking for. Inside was a land deed that took her breath away. The original document, dated 1889, granted 2,147 acres of mountain land to her great-great-grandfather, Samuel Washington, in recognition of his service as a Buffalo soldier and his role in the Indian Wars. The land grant was signed by federal officials and bore all the proper seals and documentation that established clear legal ownership, but attached to this original deed were dozens of subsequent documents that told the story of its destruction through legal manipulation. Fraudulent liens filed against the property, forged debt instruments claiming Samuel Washington owed money to local businesses, environmental assessments claiming the land was contaminated and unsuitable for habitation, tax assessments that escalated year after year until they became impossible to pay. "Look at this," Nia whispered to Marian, pointing to a series of transactions dated between 1975 and 1980. "They didn't just steal the land, they made our family pay for the privilege of having it stolen." The documents showed how the Hendricks family had acquired the Washington property, piece by piece, through a network of shell companies and corrupt officials. Every transaction was technically legal, but the pattern revealed a conspiracy designed to strip the Washington family of their inheritance through manufactured debt and impossible financial obligations. 2,800 acres, Marian said, her voice heavy with the weight of loss. Rose used to tell stories about when she was a little girl, how the family owned land from the Creek Valley all the way to the ridgeline. Timber rights, mineral rights, water rights, everything. Worth how much today? Millions. Tens of millions, probably, given the mineral deposits and the development potential. Marian traced the property boundaries on the old survey map with her finger. But more than that, it was our family's security, our inheritance, our connection to this place. Nia photographed every document in the file, understanding now why her grandmother's testimony in 1983 had been so dangerous. Rose hadn't just been reporting environmental crimes, she'd been documenting the systematic theft of black family land through legal fraud, but it was the final document in the folder that made her hands shake with rage and recognition. A quitclaim deed dated just 6 months after her grandmother's death. officially transferring the last 127 acres that remained in Washington family ownership to Hendricks Mining Consortium in settlement of outstanding legal obligations. "Aunt Marian," she said quietly, "did you sign this?" Marian studied the document, her face growing pale. "I never saw this before in my life. That's not my signature. They forged it. They waited until Grandma Rose died, then forged a document to steal the last piece of our family's land. The implications hit both of them simultaneously. Rose's death hadn't just been convenient timing for the Hendricks family. It had been necessary for completing their decades-long theft of Washington property. "We need to get back to the cave," Nia said, gathering the photographed documents. "Whatever Grandma Rose hid there, it's evidence they can't let surface. Nia, we can't. They killed her, Aunt Marian." Nia's voice carried a steel that surprised them both. "They killed my grandmother so they could forge documents and steal the last piece of land that legally belonged to our family. I'm not running away from that." The drive back toward the mountains took place in tense silence, both women aware that they were heading directly toward danger. Samson seemed to sense the gravity of their mission, staying alert and watchful as they navigated the winding mountain roads. They parked a mile away from the cabin and hiked through the forest, using a route Marian remembered from her own childhood. The familiar landscape looked different in the darkness, full of shadows that might conceal threats, sounds that might signal approaching danger. "The cave is up ahead," Nia whispered as they reached the clearing where Marcus had first confronted her. But when they approached the cave entrance, Samson suddenly froze, his hackles rising as a low growl rumbled from his chest. "Someone else was there ahead of them. I was wondering when you'd come back," said a familiar voice from the shadows. Susan Hendricks stepped into the moonlight, flanked by two men Nia recognized from the general store. All three were armed, and their relaxed confidence suggested they'd been waiting for this moment. "Susan," Marian said quietly, "you don't need to do this." "Actually, I do." Susan's voice carried the weary tone of someone who'd been dealing with a persistent problem for too long. "Your family has been a thorn in our side for 40 years, Marian. Rose was smart enough to stay quiet after we made our position clear. But apparently, her granddaughter didn't inherit her good sense. You murdered her," Nia said. "We provided incentives for her to maintain her silence. When those incentives stopped being effective, we provided alternative solutions." Susan gestured toward the cave. "She was hiding evidence in there, you know. Documents that could have caused us significant inconvenience if they'd ever surfaced, like the proof that you've been stealing our land through fraud." Susan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your land? Child, your family lost that land through their own poor financial decisions. We simply helped the process along." One of the men with Susan stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Enough talking. Let's finish this and clean up the cave. We should have done it properly when the old woman died, but before anyone could move, Samson launched himself forward with a snarl that seemed to come from some primal place of protective fury. His 90-pound body hit the gunman's center mass, sending him sprawling backward into the underbrush. "Run!" Marian shouted, pushing Nia toward the tree line, as chaos erupted behind them, shouts, cursing. The sound of people crashing through vegetation. Nia found herself following a path she'd never seen before, deeper into the forest than she'd ever ventured. Samson appeared beside her, blood on his muzzle, but his eyes bright with alertness. They ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, until their breathing was the only noise in the forest, until they found themselves in a small clearing, beside a stream that reflected the moonlight like scattered silver. "They killed her," Nia said again, the full reality finally sinking in. "They killed Grandma Rose so they could steal our land." Marian sank onto a fallen log, tears streaming down her face. "I should have protected you from this. Should have made you stay away, just like Rose wanted." "No," Nia said firmly. "Running away is what they count on. It's how they've gotten away with this for so long." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through the photographs she'd taken at the courthouse. "We have evidence now. Real evidence that proves what they've done. Evidence that won't matter if we're dead. Baby girl, then we have to make sure we stay alive long enough to get it to someone who can act on it." Nia looked back toward where they'd left the cave, knowing that whatever her grandmother had hidden there was now in the hands of the people who'd killed her. But first we need to find Marcus. He's the only person who might know how to use what we've discovered. In the distance, the sound of vehicles starting up suggested that Susan Hendricks and her associates were regrouping, probably calling in reinforcements for a more thorough search. Time was running out for making their choice between fight and flight, but as Nia looked at the documents that proved her family's century-long victimization, she knew that running was no longer an option. Her grandmother had spent 40 years in silence, waiting for someone else to find the courage to speak truth to power. That time had come to an end. They spent the night hidden in an abandoned hunting cabin that Marian remembered from her childhood, taking turns keeping watch, while Samson rested fitfully beside the cold fireplace. As dawn broke through the small windows, Nia made a decision that she knew would either save their lives or end them. "I have to go back to the cave," she announced. "Absolutely not," Marian said immediately. "They'll be watching it. They'll be watching the obvious entrance. But Marcus told me there was something hidden behind the north wall, something Grandma Rose left specifically for me to find. If we don't get it now, it'll disappear forever." Marian studied her niece's determined expression and seemed to recognize something familiar in it. "You look just like your grandmother when she made up her mind about something. Stubborn as a mountain and twice as dangerous. Will you help me?" After a long moment, Marian nodded. "But we do this smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We get in, get what Rose left, and get out." They spent an hour scouting the area around the cave, moving through the forest with the careful attention of prey animals avoiding predators. The main entrance showed clear signs of recent activity, footprints, disturbed vegetation, and the lingering scent of cigarette smoke that suggested someone had been standing guard. But Marian remembered another way in, a narrow crack in the rock formation that she and Rose had discovered as children during their own explorations of these woods. The passage was barely wide enough for an adult, but it connected to the main chamber through a series of natural tunnels that would allow them to approach the hidden cache from an unexpected direction. "I haven't been in there for 50 years, Marian whispered as they squeezed through the opening. "I hope I remember the way." The secondary tunnel system was exactly as treacherous as Nia had feared. Low ceilings that forced them to crawl, loose rocks that threatened to shift underfoot, and several points where the passage narrowed so much that Samson had to be coaxed through inch by inch. But it worked. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, they emerged into the familiar main chamber from a direction that would be invisible to anyone watching the primary entrance. "The north wall," Nia whispered, playing her flashlight beam across the stone surfaces until she found what she was looking for. The loose stone Marcus had mentioned was exactly where Grandma Rose's note had indicated, hidden behind a natural shelf that would be easy to miss unless you knew to look for it. Behind the stone was a cavity that had been carefully carved out of the living rock, waterproofed with plastic sheeting, and sealed with wax to protect its contents from decades of moisture. Inside the cavity, Nia found a small metal box that felt heavy in her hands. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. The box contained a compact digital recording device, the kind used by journalists and investigators to document sensitive conversations. Next to it was a handwritten index listing dates, times, and participants for what appeared to be hundreds of hours of recorded material. "My God," Marian breathed, reading over Nia's shoulder. Rose was recording conversations for 20 years. Nia plugged headphones into the device and scrolled to one of the most recent entries, dated just 3 months before her grandmother's death. What she heard made her blood run cold. Her grandmother's voice, clear and strong despite her age, was engaged in what was obviously a covert recording of a meeting. Other voices were present, men and women. Nia didn't immediately recognize, but whose tone suggested official authority. "The environmental impact assessment is scheduled for next month," one man was saying. "If that federal inspector finds what we think he's going to find, this entire operation shuts down permanently." Then we make sure he doesn't find it, replied a woman's voice that Nia recognized with a jolt. Mayor Patricia Wells, whose campaign posters had been everywhere during the last election. Patricia's right, said another male voice. We've handled problems like this before. One more hiking accident, one more tragic example of why people shouldn't explore dangerous terrain without proper preparation. It needs to look completely natural, Mayor Wells continued. No witnesses, no evidence, no questions that can't be answered with a shrug and a sad story about another tourist who underestimated our mountains. Nia's hands shook as she recognized the cold calculation in their voices. These weren't desperate criminals making panicked decisions. They were organized, experienced, and utterly without conscience. But it was her grandmother's voice that made her sink to her knees on the cave floor. You're talking about murder, Rose Washington said quietly. Another human being with a family, with children who love him, with a life that matters. Rose, you've been part of this community long enough to understand how things work, replied a voice Nia now recognized as Tom Hendricks, Susan's father. We take care of our own, and we protect what's ours. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions. What you're protecting isn't yours, her grandmother replied with steel in her voice. That land belongs to my family. It was stolen through fraud and violence, and now you're using it to hide crimes that would put all of you in prison for the rest of your lives. The silence that followed was heavy with threat. Rose, Mayor Wells said carefully, you've been a valued member of this community for a long time. We'd hate to see anything happen to change that status. Is that a threat, Patricia? It's a reminder that accidents happen to people who forget where their loyalties should lie. The recording ended there, but Nia could see from the index that her grandmother had continued documenting conversations right up until the week before her death. Each entry was carefully catalogued with names, dates, and brief descriptions of the criminal activities being discussed. She was building a case, Nia whispered. A complete record of their conspiracy. Marian was reading through the index with growing horror. Murders going back to 1995, drug trafficking routes, money laundering through local businesses, corruption of state and federal officials. She looked up at Nia with tears in her eyes. Your grandmother risked her life to document all of this, and they killed her for it. Nia scrolled through more entries, finding recordings that documented bribes to county officials, discussions of how to dispose of bodies, and detailed planning for making murders look like accidents. But it was the final recording, made just days before Rose Washington's death, that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and the reason why her grandmother had finally run out of time. The granddaughter is asking questions, Susan Hendricks's voice was saying. She's been through Rose's papers, and she's smart enough to put pieces together. If she starts digging in the right places, then we handle it the same way we've handled other problems, replied Mayor Wells. But first, we need to make sure Rose hasn't left any unpleasant surprises behind. Rose, you need to understand, Tom Hendricks said. And Nia realized her grandmother was present for this conversation, probably unaware that she was being recorded by her own device. Your silence has protected your family for 4 decades. But if evidence surfaces that threatens our operations, that protection ends. My granddaughter is innocent, Rose replied, her voice heavy with weariness. She doesn't know anything about what you people have done. Innocence is a luxury we can't afford, Susan said coldly. The girl comes back here every summer. She explores, she asks questions. She has the same stubborn curiosity that made you so problematic in the first place. If anything happens to Nip, nothing will happen to Nia as long as you ensure that nothing from your past surfaces to cause us problems, Tom interrupted. But Rose, you're 73 years old. How much longer can you really guarantee that? The implications hit Nia like a physical blow. They hadn't just been threatening her, they'd been using her as leverage against her grandmother for years. That's why she died, Nia said, her voice barely audible. They killed her because she was getting old. And they were afraid she couldn't protect their secrets anymore. Marian was crying openly now, her hands clasped over her mouth, as if to hold in the grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm her. She died to protect you, baby girl. She kept their secrets for 40 years, just to keep you safe, but it wasn't enough. Naya carefully packed the recording device back into its protective case. They were always going to kill her eventually, and then they were going to come after me. The sound of footsteps in the main tunnel interrupted her thoughts. Someone was approaching the cave, moving with the confident stride of people who weren't worried about being discovered. "Time to go." Susan Hendrick's voice echoed off the stone walls. "I want that cave searched thoroughly this time. Every crack, every crevice, every hiding place. If there's evidence in here, I want it found and destroyed." Nia and Marian looked at each other with the desperate understanding of people who had just run out of options. The secondary tunnel that had brought them into the cave would take too long to navigate, and the approaching voices suggested that multiple people were conducting a systematic search. "The recording device," Marian whispered. "That's what they're really after. If they destroy it, they won't," Nia said grimly, tucking the metal box inside her jacket. "Because we're not going to let them." She pulled out her phone and began uploading the most damaging recordings to a cloud storage account, working as quickly as possible while the footsteps grew closer. The files were large, and the cave's poor cell reception made the uploads painfully slow. "Hurry," Marian breathed. "Almost finished," Nia replied, watching the progress bar creep toward completion. But just as the final file finished uploading, flashlight beams appeared in the tunnel entrance, and Susan Hendrick's voice carried clearly through the chamber. "Well, well, look what we have here." They were trapped, with evidence that could destroy the Hendricks family's criminal empire, and nowhere left to run. But as Nia looked at the recording, device in her hands, her grandmother's, final gift and the key to 40 years of suppressed truth, she realized that running had never really been an option. The time for silence was over, regardless of the cost. Susan Hendrick stepped into the chamber with the casual confidence of someone who had been expecting this moment for a long time. Behind her came two men Nia didn't recognize, not locals, but professionals with the hard eyes and purposeful movements of people accustomed to violence. 40 years, Susan said conversationally, her flashlight beam playing across the cave walls. 40 years my family has been cleaning up messes caused by your family's inability to mind their own business. Marian stepped protectively in front of Nia, her body language transforming from frightened elderly woman to fierce guardian in a heartbeat. "Susan, your quarrel is with me and my generation. Leave the girl out of this." "I'm afraid that's not possible anymore," Susan replied. "Your niece has been asking questions, taking photographs, stirring up interest in things that should have been buried with your sister." She gestured to one of her companions. "Show them what we found at the courthouse." The man held up a tablet displaying security camera footage from the records room. Clear images of Nia and Marian reviewing the Washington family files, photographing documents, building their case against the Hendricks conspiracy. Electronic records. "You see," Susan continued with mock sadness, "everything documented, time-stamped, stored in multiple locations. Your little investigation has left quite a trail." But even as Susan spoke, Nia felt her phone vibrate with a notification. The uploads had completed successfully. Hours of her grandmother's recordings were now stored safely in the cloud, beyond the reach of anyone trying to destroy the evidence. "You're too late," Nia said quietly. Susan's smile faltered slightly. "Excuse me?" "The recordings. All of Grandma Rose's evidence. I've already uploaded everything to secure servers." Nia held up her phone. "Your crimes are documented, time-stamped and stored where destroying this device won't help you anymore." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Susan's casual confidence evaporated, replaced by the cold calculation of someone reassessing a situation that had just become infinitely more dangerous. "Kill them both," she said simply. "Make it look like an accident in the cave system. Tragic exploration gone wrong. But before either of the men could move, Samson erupted from the shadows, where he'd been waiting with the patience of a born predator. His attack was swift and savage. 90 pounds of protective fury focused on the nearest threat to his family. The first man went down hard, his weapon spinning away across the cave floor. The second man raised his gun. But Marian surprised everyone by launching herself forward with a strength born of desperate love, tackling him around the knees and sending his shot wild into the cave's ceiling. "Run!" Marian shouted as she grappled with the gunman. "Get out of here and get help." Nia hesitated for just a moment, torn between escaping and abandoning the woman who had raised her after her mother's death. But Susan Hendricks was already moving toward the loose weapon, and staying would mean all of them died for nothing. She ran. The secondary tunnel system that had brought them into the cave became a nightmare of desperate flight through spaces too narrow for adult pursuit. Behind her, she could hear shouts, cursing, and the sound of violence that meant Marian and Samson were still fighting for their lives. When she finally emerged from the cave system into the pre-dawn forest, Nia's first thought was to call for help. But her phone showed no signal in the deep valley, and she realized that reaching the outside world would require getting to higher ground or finding a landline. The abandoned hunting cabin where they'd spent the night was too obvious, too close to the cave. Instead, Nia headed for the one place she knew Susan Hendricks wouldn't expect her to go, back to her grandmother's cabin. The journey took 40 minutes of careful hiking, moving from cover to cover and listening constantly for sounds of pursuit. When she finally reached the cabin, it looked exactly as they'd left it, peaceful, unthreatened, a sanctuary that had protected her family for generations. Inside, Nia went directly to her grandmother's study and began systematic preparation for what she knew would be her final stand. She used the landline to call the FBI field office in Charlotte, speaking to an agent who listened with growing attention as she described the conspiracy, the murders, and the evidence she'd uploaded to cloud storage. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to stay exactly where you are," Special Agent Rebecca Martinez said. "I'm dispatching a team immediately, but it'll take them 3 hours to reach your location. Can you stay hidden and safe until then?" "I don't think hiding is an option anymore," Nia replied, watching through the window as dust clouds from multiple vehicles approached along the forest road. "They're coming. Then you need to find a secure location and defend it. Do you have any weapons?" Nia opened her grandmother's gun cabinet and found Rose's old hunting rifle, cleaned and maintained with the care of someone who understood that tools of protection needed to be ready when called upon. "Yes, good. Find a position where you can see approaches from multiple directions, and don't let anyone get close enough to rush you. We're coming, but you need to buy us time." The line went dead just as the first pickup truck pulled into the cabin's front yard. Susan Hendricks climbed out of the passenger seat. Flanked by the 2 professional killers and reinforced by 3 local men Nia recognized from town. 6 people, all armed, all committed to ensuring that her grandmother's evidence never saw the light of day. "Nia Washington," Susan called out, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "I know you're in there. Come out, and we'll make this quick and painless." Nia positioned herself at her grandmother's study window, the rifle resting on the sill with a clear field of fire across the front yard. Her hands shook as she chambered around, but her voice was steady when she called back. "I've already contacted the FBI. They're on their way." Susan's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Child, the FBI has been told stories about our operations before. Amazing how federal investigations tend to lose steam when they encounter the complexities of local jurisdiction. Not this time. I have recordings of everything, murders, corruption, the whole conspiracy, and it's already been uploaded where you can't destroy it." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Nia to hope that Susan might be reconsidering her options. But when the answer came, it carried the finality of someone who had run out of alternatives. "Then we'll just have to make sure there's no one left to testify about what those recordings mean." The attack began immediately. Two men moved to flank the cabin, while the others provided covering fire, forcing Nia away from the windows. But her grandmother's home had been built by people who understood the value of defensive positions, thick log walls that could stop rifle rounds, multiple sight lines, and carefully planned escape routes. From room to room, Nia fought a delaying action that her grandmother had unknowingly prepared her for, through years of stories about family members who had defended their homes against night riders and claimed jumpers. Each shot had to count. Each position had to be abandoned before it could be overrun. Each minute bought with careful aim and desperate courage. But 6 against 1 was mathematics that couldn't be overcome indefinitely. As her ammunition ran low and the attackers grew bolder, Nia realized that Agent Martinez's 3-hour timeline might as well have been 3 days. It was then that she heard the sound that changed everything. The deep, resonant baying of a German shepherd announcing his arrival, with the fury of a dog defending his pack. Samson burst from the forest like a force of nature, blood on his coat, but fire in his eyes. Behind him came Marian, limping but carrying one of the weapons they'd taken from their captors in the cave. "The cavalry has arrived," Marian called out grimly as she took position behind her. Sister's old pickup truck. What followed was chaos. Professional killers, discovering that they were trapped between a defended position and unexpected reinforcements. Local men who'd signed on for intimidation work finding themselves in an actual firefight. And Susan Hendricks screaming orders that no one could hear over the sound of gunfire and Samson's protective fury. But it was the distant sound of helicopters that finally broke the stalemate. Federal aircraft approaching from the east, close enough that their rotors could be heard over the battle, carrying agents who had taken Nia's evidence seriously enough to mobilize immediately. "It's over." "Susan!" Nia called out during a lull in the shooting. "The FBI is here. They have all the evidence. And the whole world is about to know what your family has been doing." Susan Hendricks emerged from behind her cover with her hands raised, but her expression carried no surrender, only the cold rage of someone who had lost everything and was determined to take others down with her. "Maybe," she said, "but at least Rose Washington's granddaughter won't live to see justice served." She was raising her gun when Samson hit her from behind. The German shepherd's final act of protection, delivered with the same fierce loyalty that had defined his entire relationship with the Washington family, as FBI agents repelled from helicopters and the sounds of battle faded into the mountain morning. Nia found herself holding her cell phone, the device that had preserved her grandmother's evidence and ensured that 40 years of silence would finally end in truth. The conspiracy was broken, the criminals were captured, and justice would finally be served. But the cost of that justice was written in blood on the ground around her grandmother's cabin, and in the courage of 3 generations of women who had refused to let evil triumph through silence. The federal agents who swept through the Hendricks compound found evidence that exceeded even Nia's expectations. Hidden in the mining office were detailed records of the criminal enterprise, financial ledgers documenting decades of illegal activities, photographs of disposal sites, and correspondence with corrupt officials at every level of government. But it was in Susan Hendricks' personal office that they discovered the most chilling evidence. A detailed file on every member of the Washington family, tracking their movements, their relationships, their vulnerabilities across 4 generations. "They've been watching us for decades," Marian said, her voice hollow with exhaustion as she reviewed the federal agent's preliminary findings. Rose, her mother, her grandmother, all of us, catalogued and monitored like specimens in some horrible experiment. Special Agent Martinez sat across from them in the cabin's main room, her expression grim as she outlined what the investigation had revealed. The Hendricks organization wasn't just a regional criminal enterprise. They were part of a network that stretched across 5 states, using legitimate mining operations to launder money from drug trafficking, human trafficking, and contract killings. Nia looked up from the medical attention she was receiving for cuts and bruises sustained during the firefight. How many people did they kill? We're still counting. Based on your grandmother's recordings and the physical evidence we've found, we're looking at least 37 confirmed homicides spanning 40 years. The number hit Nia like a physical blow. 37 people, hikers, investigators, witnesses, anyone who had gotten too close to the truth, murdered to protect the Hendricks family's criminal empire. But it's over now, Agent Martinez continued. Susan Hendricks is in custody, along with 6 associates. Mayor Wells and 3 county commissioners were arrested this morning. We've frozen assets worth over $40 million and shut down operations in 4 states. What about the land? Nia asked. The property they stole from our family? That's going to take time to sort out legally, but the fraudulent documents they used are clearly invalidated by the evidence we've recovered. Your family will get their property back, along with compensation for 4 decades of illegal occupation. Outside the cabin windows, the mountain forest looked exactly the same as it had when Nia first arrived. But everything had changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. The conspiracy that had shaped her grandmother's entire life was broken. The criminals who had terrorized the community for decades were in custody. And the truth that Rose Washington had died protecting was finally public knowledge. I need to see the cave one more time, Nia said suddenly. Agent Martinez looked concerned. Miss Washington, that's an active crime scene. Our forensics team is still... Please. Nia's voice carried a quiet authority that surprised even her. My grandmother spent 40 years protecting evidence in that cave. I need to pay my respects. The walk through the forest felt different now, less threatening, more like a pilgrimage to a sacred site. Federal agents had secured the area and marked evidence locations, but they stepped aside respectfully as Nia approached the cave entrance with Marian and Samson beside her. Inside, the chamber looked smaller than she remembered. The hiding place where her grandmother had concealed the recording device was empty now, its secrets finally revealed to the light. But near the back wall, Nia noticed something she had missed during her previous visits. An old flashlight, military issue and built to last, sat on a natural shelf in the stone. When she picked it up, it felt familiar in her hands, the same weight and balance as the flashlight her grandmother had always carried during their evening walks. That's Rose's, Marian said softly. She carried it everywhere. Said it had belonged to her father during his service in Korea. Nia turned the flashlight over in her hands and found the inscription she was looking for. Etched into the metal casing, Samuel Washington, 1952. Let this light guide you through dark places. Her father left it to her, and she left it for you, Marian continued. A symbol that the Washington family never gives up, never stops fighting for what's right, even when the darkness seems overwhelming. As they stood in the cave where so much tragedy and courage had intersected, Nia felt the weight of generations settling on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a foundation of strength that would carry her forward into whatever challenges the future might bring. Agent Martinez said the trials will take months, Marian said. They'll need us to testify, to help them understand how all the pieces fit together. Good, Nia replied, her grip tightening on her great-great-grandfather's flashlight. It's time this family stopped keeping secrets and started telling the whole truth. Outside the cave, the mountain morning was bright with possibilities that had been suppressed for too long. Justice was finally within reach, and the cycle of silence that had protected evil for 4 decades was broken forever. The light that Samuel Washington had carried through dark places would shine again, carried by his great-great-granddaughter into a future where truth mattered more than fear, and courage counted more than comfort. Samson trotted beside them as they left the cave, his job as protector complete, but his loyalty as unwavering as ever. Together, the 3 of them walked back toward a world that would never again be the same. 6 months later, Nia stood in the packed courtroom as Judge Patricia Harrison delivered the verdicts that would close the book on 40 years of criminal conspiracy. The evidence that her grandmother had spent decades collecting, combined with the forensic work of federal investigators, It built an ironclad case against every member of the Hendricks organization. Susan Hendricks, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and 37 counts of first-degree homicide. The judge's voice carried the weight of long-delayed justice. Your organization's crimes represent one of the most extensive and brutal criminal enterprises in this region's history. In the gallery behind the defendant's table, family members of the victims sat in silent witness to this moment. Some had waited decades to learn what had happened to their loved ones. Others, like Marcus Chen, had risked everything to document crimes that law enforcement had been too corrupted to investigate. Marcus himself sat in the front row, no longer the haunted figure hiding in caves and abandoned campsites. Clean-shaven and wearing a suit provided by the Federal Witness Protection Program, he had become the prosecution's star witness, his meticulous documentation proving crucial to securing convictions. The evidence in this case, Judge Harrison continued, represents an extraordinary example of citizen journalism and personal courage. Rose Washington, though she did not live to see justice served, provided the foundation upon which this prosecution was built. Her granddaughter, Nia Washington, demonstrated the same courage in ensuring that evidence reached the proper authorities. Sire felt tears sliding down her cheeks as the judge spoke her grandmother's name with the respect that had been denied for so long. In the months since the arrests, she had learned more about Rose Washington's quiet heroism, how she had secretly helped other families threatened by the Hendricks organization, how she had documented not just crimes, but also the human cost of corruption and silence. Former Mayor Patricia Wells, Judge Harrison continued, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, bribery, and abuse of public office. One by one, the verdicts fell like hammer blows against the conspiracy that had controlled the community for generations. County commissioners, business owners, law enforcement officers, an entire network of corruption dismantled by the evidence that Rose Washington had risked her life to preserve. But it was the impact on the community itself that had been most profound. In the months since the arrests, people had begun speaking openly about decades of suppressed knowledge. Business owners who had been forced to pay protection money came forward. Families who had lost loved ones to accidents demanded new investigations. A whole town began the painful process of reckoning with how fear had made them complicit in evil. The recordings we heard in this courtroom, Judge Harrison said as she prepared to conclude the proceedings, represent more than evidence of criminal activity. They document the systematic destruction of a community's moral foundation, the way corruption spreads when good people choose silence over courage. After the courtroom emptied, Nia and Marian walked together to the memorial that had been erected in the town square. 37 names were engraved in black granite, representing the known victims of the Hendricks conspiracy. At the top of the list, added at Nia's request, was the name of Sheriff James Morrison, the honest lawman whose murder had begun the cycle of corruption that took decades to break. Your grandmother would be proud, Marian said, placing flowers at the base of the memorial. She was the one who broke the cycle, Nia replied. All I did was finish what she started. No, baby girl. What you did was choose courage over safety, truth over silence. That's not something anyone can finish for someone else. It's a choice each person has to make. As they walked back toward the restored Washington family cabin, Nia reflected on how much had changed since that morning when she had followed Samson into the forest. The girl who had been looking for connection with her grandmother. His memory had discovered instead a calling that would shape the rest of her life. The journalism program she had enrolled in for the fall semester would give her the tools to investigate stories that others wanted to keep buried. The Washington Family Foundation, established with compensation money from the federal government, would provide resources for other families seeking justice for historical wrongs. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that the most powerful weapon against corruption was not law enforcement or political action. It was the simple courage of ordinary people who refused to let evil triumph through their silence. In her backpack, carefully preserved in acid-free storage, were copies of every piece of evidence that had brought down the Hendricks conspiracy. Her grandmother's journal, Marcus Chen's recordings, the fraudulent land deeds, the photographs that documented decades of criminal activity. Together, they represented more than just proof of guilt. They represented proof that truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually find its way to the light. At the cabin, Samson greeted them with the enthusiastic joy of a dog whose family had returned safely home. His protection had been crucial during the dangerous months of investigation. But now he could settle into the peaceful routine of a companion animal whose primary job was bringing happiness to the people he loved. "What now?" Marian asked, as they settled onto the porch that overlooked the restored Washington family land. Nia looked out at the forest where her grandmother had spent decades hiding evidence and protecting secrets, where Marcus Chen had lived like a fugitive, where so many people had lost their lives to greed and corruption. "Now we make sure this never happens again," she said simply. "We keep telling the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people. We keep shining light in dark places." The sun was setting behind the mountain ridges, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in that vast expanse of wilderness, other stories waited to be uncovered. Other truths waited to be told, and Nia Washington, granddaughter of Rose, great-great-granddaughter of Samuel, would be ready to find them. 1 year after the trials ended, Nia returned to the mountain cabin for the anniversary of her grandmother's birth. The forest welcomed her with the same whispered secrets it had always held, but now those secrets felt like old friends rather than hidden threats. The shadows that had once concealed danger now offered only the gentle mysteries of changing seasons and growing things. Great-Aunt Marian had arrived the day before, bringing with her a box of items that had been returned by the FBI after the evidence was no longer needed. Together, they spent the morning arranging these recovered pieces of family history throughout the cabin. Photographs, documents, personal belongings that told the story of the Washington family's century-long connection to this land. "Look at this," Marian said, unwrapping a framed photograph that Nia had never seen before. It showed her grandmother as a young woman, perhaps 25, standing in front of the cabin with her arms around a man Nia didn't recognize. Both were smiling with the uncomplicated joy of people who believed the future held only good things. "That's your grandfather," Marian explained, taken just before he shipped out for Vietnam. "He never made it back, but Rose always said you had his eyes, that same way of looking at the world like you could see right through to the truth of things." Nia studied the photograph, understanding for the first time that her grandmother's strength had been forged in loss as well as love. Rose Washington had faced tragedy, injustice, and decades of threat, yet she had never stopped fighting for what was right. That legacy felt both humbling and empowering. "Aunt Marian," Nia said carefully, "I've been thinking about after I graduate. About what I want to do with my life." Marian looked up from the box she was unpacking, her expression attentive but not surprised. In the year since the trials, she had watched her great-niece transform from a curious teenager into a young woman with purpose and determination. "I want to be an investigative journalist," Nia continued, "not just reporting on crimes after they happen, but finding the stories that powerful people want to keep buried. There are other families like ours, other communities where corruption has been allowed to flourish because good people were too afraid to speak up. That's dangerous work, baby girl. You've seen what happens to people who shine lights in dark places. I've also seen what happens when they succeed." Nia gestured toward the forest beyond the windows, where federal markers now identified the boundaries of the restored Washington family property. Grandma Rose spent 40 years collecting evidence, and that evidence brought down a criminal empire. Imagine what could happen if someone was actively investigating, actively exposing corruption before it had decades to take root. Marian smiled, and Nia saw in her expression the same mixture of pride and worry that had defined Rose Washington's approach to her granddaughter's curiosity. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said, "but she'd also want you to be careful, to remember that courage doesn't mean being reckless. I know. That's why I'll need guidance from someone who's lived through all this, someone who understands how these systems work." Nia paused, gathering courage for the question she'd been building toward all morning. "I want you to be my partner in this, Aunt Marian. Help me understand how to investigate without becoming a target, how to build cases that can't be ignored or suppressed." Marian was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Nia's eager face to the forest beyond the windows, to the memorial garden they had planted in Rose's honor. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of hard-won wisdom. "If we're going to do this, we do it right. We build networks of trustworthy people. We document everything. We never work alone, and we always have backup plans." She turned back to Nia with a smile that carried echoes of Rose Washington's determination. "And we remember that the goal isn't to be heroes. It's to make sure justice gets served, no matter how long it takes," as if sensing that an important decision had been made. Samson trotted into the room and settled between them, his presence a reminder of the loyalty and protection that had carried them through their darkest moments. The German shepherd was showing his age now, grey beginning to frost his muzzle, but his eyes remained as alert and intelligent as ever. "We should take a picture," Marian said suddenly. "All three of us here in the cabin, something to mark this moment, this decision to carry on what Rose started." They arranged themselves on the front porch, with the restored garden and the forest stretching away behind them. Marian set her phone's timer and hurried to join Nia and Samson as the camera captured their image. 3 generations of survival and determination, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. When Nia looked at the photograph later, she saw more than just a family portrait. She saw the culmination of her grandmother's sacrifice and the beginning of her own journey toward justice. The girl who had followed her dog into a hidden cave was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood that secrets only had power when good people chose to keep them. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountain ridges, Nia walked to the memorial garden they had created near the spot where the cave entrance had been sealed by federal investigators. Rose Washington's headstone bore the inscription Nia had chosen. She kept the light burning in dark places. Beside the headstone, they had planted her grandmother's favorite flowers, mountain laurel and wild azaleas that would bloom each spring in testament to the beauty that could grow from courage and sacrifice. A small plaque near the garden's entrance bore the names of all 37 victims of the Hendricks conspiracy, ensuring that their stories would not be forgotten. "I won't let their deaths be meaningless," Nia said quietly, speaking to her grandmother's memory and to the spirits of all those who had died for getting too close to the truth. "I'll keep telling stories that need to be told, no matter who wants them silenced." The wind through the pine trees seemed to carry approval, and somewhere in the distance, the call of a wood thrush echoed through the forest, the same sound that had provided background music to her childhood summers, now transformed from memory into promise. As she walked back toward the cabin, where Marian was preparing dinner and Samson waited with patient devotion, Nia carried with her more than just the weight of family legacy. She carried the understanding that truth was not just about the past. It was about creating a future where justice mattered more than convenience, where courage was valued more than silence. The brass key that had started her journey still hung from a chain around her neck. No longer just a symbol of access to her grandmother's secrets, but a reminder that every door could be opened if you had the courage to turn the key. Behind her, the restored Washington family land stretched toward horizons that held infinite possibilities for uncovering truth and serving justice. Tomorrow, she would return to her studies, to the journalism program that would give her the tools to investigate corruption wherever it flourished. But tonight, she was simply Rose Washington's granddaughter, sitting on the porch of the cabin that had sheltered generations of her family. planning the next chapter in a story that would continue as long as good people refused to let evil triumph through their silence. The mountains had kept their secrets for too long. It was time to make sure they told the truth instead.